In the final hours before dawn on June 6, 1944, the English Channel was a vast, dark plain, broken only by the low rumble of engines and the whisper of wind moving over thousands of small boats that drifted like shadows toward the shores of France. The men aboard these boats could barely see beyond the person standing in front of them, yet they knew they were part of something so enormous that none of them could fully grasp it. More than 1,000 LCVPs, Higgins Boats, lay in the water, their flat bows pointed toward the invisible line of Normandy just beyond the horizon. Each boat carried 36 men, packed shoulder to shoulder, helmets knocking together with every rise and fall of the waves, rifles clutched tightly, hands shaking, not from cold alone, but from the awareness that they were moving toward the most heavily defended coastline in Europe. The LCVP was a simple vessel, a wooden hull fitted with thin steel plating on the sides, powered by a temperamental diesel engine. Its flat bottom made it slam hard against the waves, every impact sending shudders up the legs of the men inside. The sides were low, barely chest-high, offering almost no protection from the wind or spray. Water washed over the bow, drenching uniforms, boots, and packs, making the air smell of salt and diesel oil. Still, the boats pressed forward in long lines, each one following the faint white wake of the vessel ahead like ghosts drifting across the sea. Above them the sky was black but not empty. The faint roar of aircraft, bombers, transports, fighters, formed a distant canopy of sound, a reminder that the invasion stretched from the ocean floor to the clouds. The men looked up occasionally, glimpsing faint shapes moving across the sky, but their eyes always returned to the endless rolling water ahead. The closer they came to France, the colder the air seemed. Every breath felt sharp and heavy. The men shivered, not simply from the chill, but from anticipation. They had trained for months, practiced loading and unloading, climbing down cargo nets, firing from moving decks, crawling through sand under machine gun fire. But nothing could prepare them for moving toward a real shore held by real defenders. Their officers moved quietly among them, checking belts, tightening straps, tapping shoulders, offering what little reassurance they could. A few men whispered prayers, others stared at the dark water, some closed their eyes, trying to steady their breathing. A handful smiled in tight, nervous bursts, as if forcing themselves to show courage, even if they did not feel it. Deep below the cliffs of Normandy, German sentries stood in their concrete bunkers, looking out over the black water. At first, they saw nothing, only waves and dark shapes of distant clouds. But their ears caught something faint, a low hum too steady to be wind. Then another sound, then another. Soon it became a murmuring vibration rolling across the water like an approaching storm. One sentry adjusted his binoculars, scanning the horizon. There was nothing to see, not yet. But something in the water was moving, something big, something unnatural. The German commanders had known an invasion would come, but they expected it during daylight, at high tide, or somewhere closer to the Pas de Calais. Nothing in their doctrine imagined 10 infantry divisions approaching in the darkness, carried by the largest armada of landing craft ever assembled. The LCVPs continued forward, the first faint hints of dawn beginning to bleed into the sky, making the sea shimmer in gray and silver. The men inside blinked against the weak light and began to see other boats around them, hundreds of them, stretching outward as far as they could look. The sight was overwhelming, a floating city of wooden craft, moving with slow, relentless purpose. Behind the LCVPs, larger landing craft lumbered forward, carrying tanks, trucks, engineers, bulldozers, artillery, everything needed to punch a hole through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The LCVP crews kept their eyes on the horizon, now able to make out the faint outline of land, cliffs rising like dark, jagged teeth from the mist. Men whispered to one another, "There it is, France." Some tightened their grip on their rifles, others swallowed hard against the rising fear. One soldier reached into his pocket, touched a folded photograph, and then tucked it back against his chest. The closer they came, the louder the sea seemed to get. Waves slapped against the hulls, the engines growled, the boats creaked and shuddered under strain. Then another sound rose above all of it, the distant crack of artillery. The Germans had finally seen the truth. The horizon was filled with movement, filled with boats, filled with men, a force so large that even the seasoned defenders of the Atlantic Wall were momentarily struck silent. A German officer inside a bunker stared through a viewing slit, unable to believe what he was seeing. The sea itself seemed alive, full of square-bowed boats, creeping toward the shore like an army of metal insects. He whispered to the soldier beside him, "We have never seen so many boats, nor so many men coming from the sea." The Higgins boats kept coming, their wakes crossing and merging behind them. The sky brightened further, revealing their gray shapes rising and falling over choppy water. The men aboard could now see the cliffs, the barbed wire, the beach obstacles, the faint flashes of machine gun fire beginning to spark along the shoreline. They felt the fear sharpen inside their chests, but they did not stop. The engines roared, the coxswains leaned forward, shouting above the wind, "Hold on! We are almost there!" The armada surged ahead as one unstoppable force, and for the first time, the German defenders understood that the battle for France had begun, not with a single boat or a single wave, but with thousands of men arriving all at once, carried forward by the little wooden vessels that now advanced toward the beaches of Normandy like a rising tide that no wall could hold back. As the first gray light of dawn spread across the channel, the vast armada of LCVPs came fully into view, revealing what no German defender had ever imagined could exist. More than 1,000 Higgins boats stretched across the water, forming long rows that rippled with the motion of the sea. Their flat bows lifted and dropped in the swollen waves, each impact sending spray flying over the men packed inside. The boats advanced steadily, engines growling in a low, grinding rhythm that echoed across the water like the breath of a giant waking from sleep. From the cliffs above, the Germans could now see shapes moving through the breaking light. Hundreds, then thousands of shapes, first silhouettes, then the sharp outlines of boats, small, ugly craft of wood and steel that should have looked harmless but instead looked endless. A German officer lifted his field glasses and felt his throat tighten. The water was filled to the horizon with square-bowed landing craft, each packed with armed men. The defenders had prepared for an invasion, but they had never prepared for this, a sight, a moving wall of boats more numerous than the fishing fleets of entire coastal towns. In the LCVPs, the men clung to the side rails as waves slammed hard against the hulls. Some boats rose cleanly, then dropped with a bone-shaking crash. Others dipped their bows so low that cold seawater poured inside, soaking boots, packs, and rifles. The smell of salt, diesel fuel, and vomit filled the air. Several soldiers were already hunched over, retching from the violent motion of the sea, but the coxswain at the stern shouted over the roar of the engine, "Get ready! 30 minutes to the beach." Inside the boats, the men stood pressed together so tightly that they felt every move of the person beside them. Helmets clicked against helmets, gear straps snagged on gear straps. The deck was slick with seawater, and men widened their stance to keep balance. A soldier near the bow whispered to his friend, trying to calm the tremor in his voice, "We make it off this boat. We live." The friend nodded, gripping his rifle so hard that his knuckles turned white. Above them, the sky began to fill with smoke from naval bombardment. The thunder of big guns rolled across the water, battleships and cruisers firing at German bunkers and fortifications, sending geysers of sand and concrete into the air. The men in the LCVPs felt the vibrations travel through their boots and into the wooden planks beneath them. Each distant explosion was a reminder that the world waiting ahead was lethal. The coxswain steered through the choppy water, weaving between other landing craft and avoiding submerged obstacles that could rip open the hull of a Higgins boat.
Behind him, the small diesel engine coughed and growled, pushing the little craft forward toward beaches they still could not clearly see, but could already hear. Machine gun fire began to crackle faintly over the water. The men lifted their heads, listening. The sound grew louder, sharper, more defined. Soon they could hear ricochets skipping off metal and the distant ping of bullets striking landing barriers. The reality of the moment closed in on them. The Germans were awake now and firing. The LCVPs kept going. The Armada moved with immense coordination, each coxswain following the white wake of the boat ahead, keeping formation as if pulled by a single invisible line. Over the rising noise of engines and gunfire, officers shouted orders: raise ramp, stay low, prepare to rush. On one boat, a soldier clutched the wooden side so tightly that splinters dug into his palm, but he did not loosen his grip. He stared at the cliffs ahead where flashes of enemy muzzle fire glinted like fireflies in the gloom. Another man pressed his forehead to the metal ramp, taking slow breaths, trying to steady the shaking in his legs. The closer the boats came to shore, the more the German defenders felt shock settling into their bones. They had expected landing craft, maybe a few dozen, maybe 100, but this was different. This was not a landing, this was a flood. A tidal wave of men and boats and steel, all moving toward them with the weight of a continent behind it. A German machine gunner shouted to his commander, asking where to aim because the sea was so full of targets that he could not choose. The commander did not answer at first. He simply stared as the horizon filled completely with boats, Higgins boats. As far as he looked, more boats kept appearing as if the sea itself was giving birth to them. The Armada surged on. The LCVPs were now close enough that the men inside could see the surf crashing around wooden stakes and steel obstacles planted by the Germans to rip open hulls. They could see smoke drifting along the beaches from naval shells exploding. They could see flashes of light from enemy bunkers firing into the incoming waves. They could also see other landing craft ahead hitting the shallows, water rising around them before the coxswains cut engines and the boats ground hard into sand. And then, suddenly, shockingly, they could see men running off the first boats into the storm of fire. The men in the second wave tightened their grips on rifles. The ramp ahead of them rattled under machine gun fire. The coxswain shouted, "Hold on, 30 seconds." The Higgins boats raced toward the shore, carrying not one company, not one battalion, but an entire generation of soldiers moving in at once. The Germans watched in disbelief, unable to understand how so many men could come so quickly. But the answer was simple. The Higgins boat had turned the sea into a highway, and America had filled that highway with an army. The cliffs loomed closer. The ramp shook again. Bullets hissed over the bow. The men braced themselves, and the Armada prepared to open the gates of France in one unstoppable moment.
The closer the LCVPs came to the beaches of Normandy, the more the world narrowed into a tunnel of noise, fear, and rising adrenaline. The men inside no longer saw the sea around them or the sky above them. They saw only the ramp in front of their boots, the thin sheet of steel that separated them from France and from death. The coxswain looked over his shoulder, shouting above the engine, "Hold tight! When that ramp drops, move!" The boat lurched violently as it struck an underwater sandbar, then scraped forward, grinding toward shallow water. Behind the thin steel walls, bullets snapped and ricocheted, sparks dancing off the metal. The men pressed their bodies low, bracing against the sides, water sloshing around their ankles. Each wave lifted the LCVP, then slammed it down again, sending cold seawater over their helmets and into their faces. The boat shuddered, taking hits from machine gun bursts that punched through the wooden hull and showered splinters across the men inside. A corporal near the bow whispered to himself over and over, "Just get off the boat, just get off the boat." It was a desperate mantra shared by every soldier who had trained in landing operations. They knew the truth. The Higgins boat was not the battlefield, it was the coffin, if they stayed too long. Ahead of them, the cliffs began to loom darker, more defined. More muzzle flashes flickered along the German bunkers. A machine gun somewhere above sent a whirling line of bullets spraying across the water, cutting through waves like a saw. Through the smoke, the men could see the first wave already fighting for survival. Bodies floated in the surf, helmets bobbed in the rising foam, explosions burst among the beach obstacles, and the shrill metallic ping of bullets striking steel structures filled the air. The coxswain gunned the engine one last time, pushing the LCVP as far onto the sand as the tide allowed. Then, with a final grinding heave, the boat stuck itself into the beach. The engine cut. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then the ramp dropped. The steel plate slammed onto wet sand with a deafening crash, letting in blinding light and the roar of Normandy. The first men leaped forward and were cut down instantly. The MG-42s on the bluffs above fired at nearly 1,500 rounds per minute, turning the open mouth of the LCVP into a killing zone. The men behind fell back instinctively, pressing against each other, trapped for a split second in the funnel of death, until officers screamed, "Go, go, move, move, get off the boat!" The soldiers surged forward, their boots splashing into the freezing surf. Some stumbled immediately, weighed down by packs, waterlogged uniforms, and fear. Others lunged ahead, running low through waves as bullets whipped past their ears. The boat rocked as men jumped off, leaning hard to one side. Then the coxswain yelled, "Reverse, reverse, we have to clear the ramp." Another wave of LCVPs needed the same landing space. Behind them, the next craft drove toward the beach, cutting through smoke and chaos, bringing more men into the storm. Some hit underwater obstacles, explosions bursting beneath their hulls, throwing men into the waves. Others lowered ramps into water too deep, forcing soldiers to wade chest high as gunfire shredded the surf. Around them, the ocean churned with broken equipment, shattered wooden planks from destroyed boats, and the desperate shouts of wounded men calling for medics. The Higgins boat crews worked with frantic precision. Some boats backed away immediately, searching for new landing lanes. Others stayed long enough to pick up survivors, pulling soaked, bleeding soldiers over the gunwales into the cramped interior. One coxswain leaned over the side, dragging a wounded man onto the deck as bullets kicked fountains of water around him. He shouted to a sailor at the stern, "Get us out of here," and the engine roared back to life. On the beach itself, more LCVPs landed every minute, their ramps hitting sand in a relentless rhythm, metal striking earth, carrying wave after wave of soldiers onto Omaha and Utah. Hitler's Atlantic Wall was designed to stop an army, but it had never been designed to stop thousands of men arriving all at once. Through the mist and smoke, German gunners now saw a terrifying sight. The Higgins boats kept coming. The sea was full of them. Each time one ramp fell, 36 more men rushed into the chaos. And with every new wave, the Americans pushed farther inland, even as bodies filled the incoming surf. The Higgins boat made possible the one thing the Germans feared most, a continuous flow of soldiers that no amount of fire could slow down. The defenders began to panic, reports flowing through their bunkers, shouting that more boats were coming, more men, more waves. The sight overwhelmed them. A German officer near Pointe du Hoc wrote later, "They were everywhere, small square boats opening like jaws and spilling men into the water faster than we could fire." The Higgins boat made that nightmare real. Every minute, another dozen Higgins boats struck the sand and opened their ramps. Every minute, more soldiers charged forward, pushing the front line higher up the beach. The storm of Omaha and Utah should have annihilated the attackers. Yet because the Higgins boats delivered men non-stop, the Americans did not break. The ramp of each LCVP was a doorway into hell, and every man who ran through it widened the breach in Hitler's Atlantic Wall, inch by inch, until the tide of soldiers became impossible to stop.
For the German defenders crouched inside the bunkers and trenches of the Atlantic Wall, the first minutes of the invasion felt like chaos, but chaos they believed they could still contain. They had repelled raids before. They had studied Allied amphibious doctrine, and they trusted their reinforced positions, towering cliffs, minefields, barbed wire, and the deadly precision of the MG-42. Yet by the time 30 minutes had passed, something impossible had happened. Something none of their training scenarios had ever predicted. The Americans were landing faster than they could be killed. The reason was not a miracle. It was the machine that kept arriving again and again across the surf, the Higgins boat. Each LCVP carried 36 soldiers, and more than 1,000 of them surged toward the beaches at dawn. Their shallow draft let them pass over underwater sandbars. Their flat bottoms let them ground high on the beach. Their ramps dropped instantly, releasing men into the surf before pulling away to make room for the next wave. No defensive doctrine in the German manuals accounted for this relentless rhythm, this conveyor belt of human determination. The Germans fired hundreds of thousands of rounds in the first half hour, but the stream of landing craft did not slow. In fact, the number of boats seemed to increase as more waves appeared from the gray horizon.
The German observation post reported the same thing along every beach sector. They are still coming. There is no end to them. On Omaha, where the slaughter was worst, the ramp of nearly every LCVP opened into a storm of bullets, but the men still poured out. Some were shot immediately. Some waded into deep water and drowned. Some crawled desperately toward hedgehogs and metal obstacles for cover. Yet behind them, more boats crashed into the sand. More ramps fell. More men rushed forward. The sea turned into a highway of Higgins boats moving in synchronized lines, roar forward, slam into sand, open the ramp, unload, reverse back away, turn around, repeat. Within minutes, German machine gunners realized something terrifying. They could not reload fast enough. Every time they repositioned the barrel or changed ammunition, a new boat landed. A new wave of soldiers appeared, and each wave pushed slightly farther ashore. For every group that fell, another group filled the gap. The Germans shouted for more ammunition, more men, more artillery support, but their requests were drowned out by the roar of naval guns from battleships offshore. The blast shook the cliffs, throwing debris across bunker floors. Each explosion marked another blow to Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The commanders tried to make sense of the reports coming in from observers along the coast. Some exaggerated or panicked. "They are landing everywhere," said one. "They are too many," said another. But one report stood out, written in a hurried scrawl by a lieutenant watching Utah Beach. He wrote simply, "They come like a flood." From inside the LCVPs, the Americans felt none of that strategic understanding. They felt only the raw intensity of survival, the cold salt water around their legs, the blur of sand and smoke, the crack of bullets striking the ramp as it fell. They crashed into the beach, running as fast as they could while more boats grounded behind them. The sea filled with more Higgins boats, maneuvering around wrecks, dodging obstacles, passing burning craft that had been hit by artillery, but still pushing forward. The coxswains performed miracles, steering with one hand while shouting orders with the other. Their boats had no armor, no shields, no turrets. The steering position was exposed, a man standing behind a small metal plate guiding his craft under direct fire. Yet they kept going. The German defenders saw all of it and still could not accept what they were witnessing. Their minds could not merge the two truths together. The Higgins boats were small, weak, lightly built from plywood and thin steel, and yet they were landing an entire army all at once. The fire rate of an MG-42 could tear apart a man in seconds, but it could not tear apart the sea, not when the sea kept delivering wave after wave after wave. In the bunkers, commanders began to realize that the numbers were turning against them. The Americans had not sent one regiment or one division. They had sent entire corps, entire armies, all of them arriving through the mouths of small, square boats. The LCVPs created momentum faster than German defenses could react. A bunker destroyed by naval fire left a hole in the line, but before reinforcements could move in, 3 more waves of Americans were already pushing past it. A machine gun emplacement jammed or overheated, and in those few critical moments, dozens of men sprinted across open sand, impossible to stop. The Higgins bunk did not just land soldiers. It crushed the pace of German defense. It shattered their ability to regain control. It turned the invasion into a race, one the Germans were never equipped to win. Within 30 minutes, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers had hit the beaches. Within 30 minutes, the sea was thick with landing craft circling back for more troops. Within 30 minutes, the German defenders realized the truth that shook them to their core. The Atlantic Wall had not been broken by tanks or bombers. It had been broken by speed. Speed brought by thousands of little wooden boats, each one delivering another heartbeat of the greatest invasion in history. And as more LCVPs appeared on the horizon, the defenders understood that the flood was still rising and nothing they did could slow it down.
By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy no longer looked like the proud concrete fortress Germany had spent years building. They looked drowned, overwhelmed, consumed by a tide of men that refused to stop coming. The Atlantic Wall still fought, but the shape of the battle had already changed. The moment the Higgins boats arrived in their thousands, the outcome stopped belonging to the bunkers and started belonging to the sea. The LCVPs did not look like war-winning machines. They were small, wooden boxes with diesel engines that coughed and sputtered,
thin steel panels that rattled under machine gun fire and flat bottoms that slammed so hard against waves that teeth were knocked loose. But on D-Day, they accomplished something no battleship, no bomber, no tank could do. They delivered an army, 36 men at a time, without pause, hesitation, or fear. And they kept delivering that army until the German defense cracked under the weight of sheer, unbroken momentum. The Higgins boat was simple. That simplicity made it powerful. Andrew Higgins, the man who designed it, once said that the boat could be built by anyone with a hammer and saw, and in a way he was right. American factories, shipyards, and even furniture companies produced them by the hundreds. Because they were fast to build and cheap to make, the Allied invasion planners realized something few commanders in history had ever understood. The fastest path to victory was not overwhelming firepower, it was overwhelming arrival, quantity, not just of ships but of legs, boots, rifles, bodies, presence. After the ramp dropped, men kept coming from the sea until the Germans had no breath left to resist. Inside every Higgins boat lay a piece of the Allied war machine, the kind the Germans never fully understood. Factories in Ohio cutting planks, Louisiana mills shaping plywood, California plants stamping steel plates. All of it ended up in the flat bow of the LCVP, carrying soldiers toward France in the greatest test of industrial strength the world had ever seen. The men who lived through D-Day would remember everything about the boats long after the war. The reek of diesel fumes mixed with the cold stink of seawater, the way the boat shook violently when it scraped the bottom, the slam of the metal ramp hitting sand, the shouted orders lost in the roar of gunfire, the hiss of bullets slicing through the surf, the thud of soldiers hitting the water and running toward the beach. Some of the boats never made it back, hit by artillery, mortars, mines, or machine guns, splintering into pieces that floated briefly before sinking into the rising tide. Coxswains died at their stations, hands still clenched on the controls, as their boats drifted into shore with wounded men aboard. But the majority did return, engines sputtering through smoke and debris, veering back toward the transport ships to collect the next wave of soldiers. Again, and again, and again. Because the Higgins boat was never meant to deliver one attack. It was meant to deliver thousands. The Germans who survived the day later wrote that the sight of the boats haunted them. The sea kept opening, the boats kept coming. Every time they thought they had repelled the last wave, more boats arrived until the shoreline seemed to shift from water to men. And when the battle was finally decided, when the smoke cleared and the beach was secured, the Higgins boats did not rest. They ran supplies ashore, dragged artillery across sand, carried wounded men back to hospital ships, refueled, repaired, and turned around to repeat the process day after day, until a foothold became a bridgehead, and the bridgehead became the beginning of the end for Hitler's Europe. Yet, after the war, few people spoke of the Higgins boat. The world remembered the heroism of infantry, the bravery of paratroopers, the weight of bombers and tanks. The names of commanders, generals, and divisions filled books, films, and documentaries, but the little wooden square-bowed boat that had carried those heroes into France faded into silence, overshadowed by the glory of victory it had helped create. Andrew Higgins never complained, but he knew the truth better than anyone. He once said that without his boat, we would not have won the war. And Eisenhower himself agreed, describing the LCVP as the boat that won World War II. But history rarely likes simple heroes. It prefers dramatic machines, powerful weapons, sleek warships, and great military leaders. But the soldiers who lived through D-Day remembered the LCVP differently. They remembered it as the boat that opened the door to France, the boat that turned the sea into a bridge, the boat that carried them from fear into battle, from uncertainty into history. A veteran decades later stood before a preserved Higgins boat and placed his hand on the worn metal of the ramp. He whispered, "That little boat carried my whole generation ashore." And he was right. The Higgins boat did not look like a legend. It did not sound like a legend. It did not fight like a legend. But on June 6, 1944, it became one anyway. It turned the tide of war, not with guns or armor, but with relentless courage and unstoppable purpose. It carried the weight of a continent on its wooden hull, and though it never took the glory, it delivered the victory that changed the world forever.